Hello, bonjour, and welcome to your new Bonheur Private Wines video. Today, I want to tell you a little wine story. Quite short, but fascinating. The story of the single most expensive wine coming out of Spain. Our next collection from the club that you will receive will be about Spanish wine, so we might as well slowly start looking into Spain as a fascinating wine country. You're not going to be receiving the wine that we're looking at today because it's so rare and very expensive, upwards of $1,000 a bottle. And the strangest thing is that you've never heard of it. And even I would bet that most wine connoisseurs around the world have never heard of it either. Have you ever heard of this wine made in the appellation of Toro? Have you ever heard of the appellation of Toro? And that wine is called Teso La Monja. Have you ever heard that name before? Well, let me tell you the story of the most expensive Spanish wine. Have you even heard of the village and the wine appellation called Toro, or Toro, you could say in English? Well, it is fairly known at this stage in the world of wine, but certainly not as famous as Rioja or Ribera del Duero or Priorat. Those have been pumping out all of the finest and most expensive Spanish wines for decades now, with such legendary wines that you may have heard about as being the most expensive in Spain before, like Dominio de Pingus or Vega Sicilia. Those are in the Ribera del Duero legendary wines, or Bodegas La Muga or La Rioja Alta in Rioja, or Álvaro Palacios in Priorat. Those are the wines people think of when they think of the most expensive bottles from Spain, not about Toro. Coincidentally or not, I did spend 2 years of my winemaking career working in Spain. I worked in many different countries, but one of my most significant experiences as a winemaker was in Spain for 2 vintages, some 15 years ago, and it happened to be in this small village of Toro. So I know the area quite well, even though this Teso La Monja wine didn't even exist at the time, believe it or not. But we'll get back to this strange story in a minute. Let me tell you about Toro. It's indeed a rather small medieval village, somewhat lost in the nothingness of the semi-arid climate of Castilla, so the heart of the culture of Spain. You have to drive about 45 minutes outside of cities like Valladolid or Salamanca through that, what looks like half a desert of Castilla, and finally you get to that small village of Toro surrounded by vineyards. It's the third lesser known wine growing area where the iconic Spanish grape Tempranillo is grown. Tempranillo has for centuries been making the most revered wines in Spain, but up until recently, Rioja and Ribera del Duero were the reigning wine regions. Rioja has a bit of a cooler climate of the three, being closer to the Atlantic Ocean, so making finer but also a bit thinner wines from Tempranillo. Ribera del Duero is a bit southern, and it's warmer as well, so the wines are denser and bigger. Toro is even more inland, so it's even warmer, and extremely hot summers there, so the expression of Tempranillo here is huge. It's massive, with extremely concentrated wines often reaching 15+% of alcohol. That's in short the Toro wine region, but let's discuss the best, I've been said, of all Toro wines now, and certainly the most expensive one. Back when I was living in Toro around 2007-2008, we heard A very big winery transaction had taken place in the area. One of the most famous bodega or winery in Toro, called Bodega Numantia, had become famous internationally for scoring 100 points by Robert Parker's Wine Advocate for its flagship wine that was called Termantia, released a few years prior. Their vintage 2004 for that wine had received 100 points. Big news. There's only a handful of 100 points wines announced by the Wine Advocate every year. This sort of news is big for a region. It had propelled the bodega into international stardom. Just a relatively short while after this scoring performance, the Eguren family, who owned Bodega Numantia, announced that they had sold the bodega to the French luxury group LVMH, the company headed by one of the richest men on earth, Bernard Arnault. I'm pretty sure you've heard about him, who owns all the most famous luxury brands, Louis Vuitton, Chanel, Gucci, but also wine and alcohols brands like Moet & Chandon, Champagne, Veuve Clicquot, Dom Pérignon, many more, Ruinart, Château d'Yquem, also in Sauternes, one of the wonders of the world of wine, Cheval Blanc in Saint-Emilion, and so on. So LVMH had bought the flagship winery of Toro, that Bodega Numantia, for over 20 million euros, I think it was at the time, which was big for a rural area. The fact alone that such an important wine luxury company had an interest in Toro wines solidified the reputation of Toro as a rising star in the wine world. Not only had they scored a 100-point wine, but a big company was buying for a lot of money a winery there. I was personally quite pleased with that news too, since I was a winemaker of another flagship winery in Toro, making one of the best wines in the appellation as well, a wine called Campo Eliseo. So I too felt like I was where a winemaker ought to be at the moment, at the time. I was in the hot area, figuratively and literally. Where this story becomes interesting and where it gets onto our wine of the day, the Eguren family that had sold Numantia, they are a very important and famous family in the Spanish wine world, as they also own a famous winery in Rioja, established in 1870, an old winery called Sierra Cantabria, one of the most famous wines from Rioja and from Spain. So a very old wine family from Spain. After selling that winery in Toro to LVMH, they didn't leave that rising Toro area. They bought instead another vineyard, a different vineyard, and started a different winery, a different project that they called Teso La Monja. Teso La Monja is fairly big estate with 200 plus acres of vines, with some of its vineyards dating back to the pre-phylloxeric era, over 130 years of age. They avoid using herbicides and systemic products, as is quite popular now. They look for the natural balance of the vineyard, with small productions of between 1,000 to 2,000 kilograms per hectare of grapes. And from their best and oldest vineyards, they make this flagship wine, simply called, just like the winery name, Teso La Monja. And apparently this wine is so good, and the reputation of the Eguren family is so great, and that they brought this Toro project to selling and pricing this wine above everyone else in Spain, even higher than an old Spanish icon that has been making the most famous Spanish wine for decades, like Vega Sicilia, or even a more recent project like Dominio de Pingus, which has also become a cult wine in Spain. They've been making wine for 30 years. It was the most expensive Spanish wines. Now Teso La Monja is. This is how this wine, unheard of some 15 years ago, it didn't even exist, is now the most expensive Spanish wine of them all, selling at an average global price of $1,200,000 a bottle, depending on the vintage, while the second most expensive, Pingus, sells at around $1,000. And now you know about the most expensive wine. I hope you enjoyed today's wine story. A bit more of a more casual way of talking about wine. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you soon in the wonderful world of wine. Cheers.